Hello, I'm Allison. Welcome to my booktube channel. Today I'm talking about the Farseer Trilogy by Robin Hobb. There are about 1 million YouTube videos summarizing these books and previewing them for people who haven't read them. So this video is for people who have read them. This is going to be a deep dive analysis into a few topics I haven't really seen much discussed on YouTube. But first, I want to say thank you so much to Lily from Lily's Library, who is how I found out about these books and got interested in reading them. She has lots of videos on the entire realm of the Elderlings world, so definitely go check her out. But jumping right in, I first want to talk about how I have kind of a bone to pick with the entire internet about the way that Hobb does characterization. I have heard so many people describe these books as having morally gray characters, and I think that is completely wrong. It's true that these books are very character driven, but I know exactly who the good guys and the bad guys are. If you look through the characters in this book, other than Shade, who I think genuinely is morally gray, and his willingness to sacrifice fits at times for the interests of the king probably are not morally correct choices. Other than him, all of these characters are very clearly good guys or bad guys. If you think about the other main characters, Burke has integrity like shooting out of his pores, and Verity too is completely upright all of the time. Fitz always tries to do the right thing, even if he doesn't always succeed. Patience is always a good person. Queen Kittrikin is always a good person. I guess the king could be considered morally gray, but mostly just because he's such a blind fool that he creates all sorts of mischief by his unwillingness to accept reality. But then on the other hand, the bad guys are clearly the bad guys. Regal, clearly evil. Galen, clearly evil. The Red Ship Raiders, clearly the bad guys. There's no question at any point in my mind which of these characters are morally good and which of them are evil. And I think people maybe are confusing the concept of morally gray characters with characters who are put in difficult moral situations. A morally gray character is a character like Dara in City of Brass or Paul in Dune. This is someone who wants to do the right thing, but gets confused about what the right thing is. Either they get too committed to a particular cause and they're unable to recognize that they can't pursue that cause at all costs, or selfish reasons, like a Boromir in Lord of the Rings, where selfish reasons sort of pull them off the path, but eventually they're able to circle back and find their way. Morally gray characters typically are characters you come to care for. They're not malicious, but they do bad things. And on the other hand, there are good characters who are put into impossible moral situations, but that doesn't turn them into morally gray characters. If you take like Alan Turing in The Imitation Game, who has to make the choice whether to intercept the attack on a British passenger convoy, or which will let the Nazis know the Brits have broken Enigma and undo all of this work that maybe is going to end the war, or he has to let those people die. That is an impossible moral choice. But being forced into that situation doesn't make Turing a morally gray character. And the characters in this book are like that. They face impossible choices, but none of the good guys are making like the wrong moral decision. Sometimes they don't have full information. Sometimes the choices they make don't turn out to be the right one. But these are not characters who are choosing the wrong thing, choosing, total war over mercy, or choosing to be selfish over the good of the people. These are incredibly good self-sacrificing characters, and the evil characters are really evil. You don't really get a good explanation for why the evil characters are evil that makes you root for them or really understand them deeply in the way that a morally gray antagonist might have. So I really think the internet is just wrong to say that Robin Hobb writes morally gray characters. But that doesn't mean I didn't like these books. I really, really, really liked these books. And one of the things that I liked about them so much was the 90s vibe, late 90s, early 2000s fantasy vibe of them. They felt to me more like Tamara Pierce books than any book that I've read maybe since reading Tamara Pierce. I mean, the conflict with Regal and not being able to get rid of Regal, even though everyone kind of knew he was evil, felt so much like the conflict with Duke Roger Conte in the Lioness trilogy. But I think that tricked me into reading the books kind of wrong. And I will get back to that at the end. I want to talk about why I completely read these books the wrong way. But one thing that was really interesting to me about the connection between particularly the Lioness Quartet and these books was the queerness. I mean, the Lioness Quartet are these incredibly queer-coded books. Alana, the main character, spends the first 2 books disguised as a boy, and throughout that time is sort of starting to develop romantic relationships with some of the men around her, or the boys around her. And these books, I thought, had some incredibly queer-coded themes. The first was I loved the allegory of the wit as queerness. Now, I'm not the first to say this, but the way that Fitz has to hide this aspect of himself and the shame that he feels because society is teaching him that it's a wrong way to be and a wrong way to connect is so fascinating to me. And so many of the ways that it plays out in his relationships struck me as just really, really authentic to the experience that queer youth have growing up often. So the relationship with Burke, for instance, who also has the wit and has a lot of internalized shame about his abilities and has rejected them in order to try to live in a way that is consistent with what society wants. And Fitz, once Burke suspects that Fitz has the wit, then Fitz has to hide it from him, hide this aspect of himself from Burke. And whenever Burke finds out that Fitz is engaging in the wit, he gets really angry and he, pushes Fitz away. And then when they eventually reconcile, Fitz has to basically hide this aspect. Burke is sort of willing to turn a blind eye to this part of Fitz, but he doesn't want to know about it. And that reminded me so much of some of the relationships that, I know that, queer kids in the 90s had to their parents. And I also thought it was really interesting that Burke's objection to Fitz's wit is a combination of he thinks it's wrong and also he's worried about what society is going to do to Fitz if Fitz, goes down this path. And that also reminded me so much of the kinds of conversations that, the parents of queer kids would have, where they would say, I don't care that much, but I don't want my kid to have to be bullied. I don't want them to live a lifestyle that's going to result in them being ostracized from society. And for that reason, they would then discourage their children's queerness. And that would create this distance between the children and parents. And that, all of that plays out exactly the same way in the dynamic between Fitz and Burke. And I also loved the dynamic between Fitz and Black Rolf, because that also reminded me so much of the ways that queer communities, and especially this is all happening, in the late 90s, early 2000s. I mean, it's so different today, where I think like 30% of Gen Z Americans identify as queer in some way. I'll try to find that statistic and link it below. But it's just a completely different world than it was, at the time Hobb was writing the initial entries in this series. And yeah, and the way that queer people had to sort of leave society and create these safe spaces for themselves reminded me so much of Black Rolf and their witted community that was, sort of in the forest outside of society. And similarly, both queer people and the witted community had to develop like clandestine methods of identifying each other and of communicating. And so I just felt like this allegory worked in so many different directions, and I thought that was really wonderful. I also love Queen Kittrick as a closeted bisexual. That just slaps. And then, of course, you know, you can't forget the Fool. And I should say, you know, even though life for queer people has gotten in many places much better, there are obviously many places where, you know, queer people are still ostracized and have to hide themselves and experience a ton of shame. And certainly, you know, that kind of ostracization and bullying and, you know, and violence is still exercised against trans people. And so it was really wonderful also to have a, you know, non-binary, gender fluid trans character in these books, you know, canonically trans character in these books. I mean, I believe that Hobb has intentionally avoided ever saying what the Fool's, as the Fool calls it, I think, like plumbing or equipment is, you know, to focus on the fact that that's not what the Fool perceives to be the most important thing about them. And the Fool's conversation with Fitz, where Starling thinks that the Fool is a woman, even though he's been living and presenting as a man because he's in love with Fitz, is just so wonderful. And, you know, Fitz saying, well, do you love me the way that a man loves a woman? And the Fool saying, well, I love you the way that a man loves a man. I just thought that was really wonderful. And Starling's confusion over why the Fool is not attracted to her, hilarious. I mean, really priceless and wonderful. I also loved the way that conflict between Starling putting her foot in her mouth and saying something really insensitive to the Fool was set up, where these are two people who have a relationship and are, you know, they're not antagonistic to each other, and yet Starling says the wrong thing, and the book really accepted the space for that hurt, that, you know, she fucked up and she said something really hurtful, but it, you know, it wasn't in this, like, now we have to cancel Starling kind of thing, right? Like, the characters were able to figure it out and work past it and find a way to, like, continue carrying affection for each other. And so I really, really loved that. I thought, I mean, one of the things these books do so well, just generally, is show the ways that good, well-meaning people can still really hurt each other, and how there are ways to work back from that, and what the process of sort of working back to each other looks like. And I thought this was a great example of that. I also think these books do an incredible job of addressing trauma and PTSD. Fitz lives this incredibly traumatic life, starting with being abandoned by his mother and father, and then being traumatized by Galen, and then being tortured by Regal. And the book does an incredible job of showing his process and the way that he both works through that trauma and also is still marked by it. I really, really loved the metaphor of Fitz creating skill walls that shut out the harms that Galen was doing to him, and how those walls were protecting him, but also were preventing him from being able to skill to Verity. And that is such a wonderful way to describe the putting up of emotional walls, the emotional numbing that people often do in response to trauma to protect themselves, and the way that numbing out your bad feelings also prevents you from being able to feel good feelings, and it gets in the way of genuine connection, which is built on vulnerability, and having to walk that line between opening yourself up and being vulnerable enough to connect to people while also, you know, feeling like or being under attack and having to put up emotional walls to protect yourself. I just thought that was such, the idea of Fitz's skill walls was such a wonderful way to address that topic and sort of work through that topic. And also, I think it must be said, you know, this is like years before Brene Brown, right? You know, this is, I think this is like a really prescient and ahead of its time portrayal of sort of the emotional response people have to trauma in terms of pop culture. One of the most fascinating moments I thought was when Fitz finally realizes that Galen had put this spell on him to make him think he had always been bad at skill. He's with Verity, and Verity helps him clear his mind of Galen's influence. And he realizes that he was good at skill before he had this, you know, traumatic incident with Galen. But even recognizing that, it wasn't like then he was all better. And I thought that was also such a wonderful portrayal of how trauma affects people. And, you know, when you're doing the work of recovery, starting to recognize where the trauma is coming from, where the shame and the self-doubt is coming from is the first step. But once you figure out, you know, the cause of your trauma, that doesn't suddenly magically make it go away. Then you have to still do the hard work of like getting back to your life. And yeah, so I thought that was such a lovely moment. And I also loved how the book didn't try to rush the characters past their trauma because it was convenient for the plot. I think one of the things about this book, and this is going to go to the last section about sort of what I got wrong reading it, but one of the things about this book is that it can be very frustrating because it feels like the characters are just like sort of nothing's happening. It's just a slog. The characters are just repeating these same cycles. And I thought in some ways that puts on you as the reader a kind of similar frustration that I think people often experience when they're interacting with people in their life who have dealt with trauma, where it feels like the person experiencing the trauma is like not recovering within what feels like a sort of reasonable timeline, or they are recovering and then relapsing, and it can be incredibly frustrating. I mean, you know, both for those sort of people who love someone who's experienced trauma and the person who has themselves experienced trauma, that, you know, this path is not linear and it's not fast and it doesn't always move at a like rational pace. And I thought this book in some ways did a really good job of making you feel that kind of frustration, where sometimes I felt like reading this book like, oh, come on, okay, just get on with it. Like, let's just move past this. But obviously that's just not how trauma processing works at all. And so I thought that was a really well done, sort of structurally, I thought it was really well done how she communicated that experience to you through the process of reading the book. Okay, but so the final thing I want to say about these books is that I really, really read them wrong. I'm not the first person to say this, but these titles are incredibly misleading, both in terms of the total amount of assassinating that happens in these books, and also in terms of how exciting they're going to be. So little actually happens. You know, 80% of the conflict is internal, and I was not expecting that at all. And I really flew through these books because I couldn't wait to get to the resolution. She set up all these amazing, fascinating conflicts, not just in terms of interpersonally, but also in terms of the world and the political situation. And I was so excited to get to the end to figure out how it was all going to resolve. And then when it resolves in the last 50 pages with this sort of like Deus Ex Machina resolution, when I first read it, I was incredibly disappointed. But I have, on further reflection, come to think that it is a brilliant way to end these books. These books I originally described them as kind of like Tamara Pierce, and I think they are sort of like Tamara Pierce had a baby with like a Ken Follett book, like Pillars of the Earth. But also, they're very James Joyce, like particularly the middle book. Oh, sorry, I'm holding the middle book. Particularly the middle book has this wonderful sort of Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man or The Idiot by Elif Batuman quality to it, where truly kind of nothing happens, and the point is not any of the things that happen. The point is what's going on inside the protagonist's mind. And these books have really left me thinking about them so much after I finished reading them, and going back and thinking about each of the different plot arcs that the various characters had. And I think by de-emphasizing the you know, the big battle at the end, Hobb really tunes her microscope on each of the individual character arcs, and I have really come to appreciate how every single character gets a brilliant character arc. Like, I absolutely loved Queen Kittrican and Verity's marriage. I thought the way that their misperceptions about each other led them to be unable to show up for each other. You know, Verity is ashamed that Queen Kittrican has become married to this old man that he thinks, why would she want to be married to me? And Queen Kittrican has this anxious compulsion to please Verity that, you know, ends up putting so much pressure on him. And I thought that was so wonderful because there are so many real relationships that break down, you know, for exactly those reasons, where each person has their own mental perception of the way that the relationship is going, and they feel like they're failing or the relationship is failing, and, you know, they just are completely on different pages about what their actual needs are, but they, you know, just don't have the time or space because of, you know, personal emergencies or trauma or whatever to figure it out together. So I just thought that was so wonderful that, you know, this relationship that is not between the main character at all has this like nuance and depth to it. And even like the most minor characters, even like Cobb has this wonderful character arc where, in a way that is so true to life, people get swept up in these horrible like political and social movements for reasons that start out as like petty interpersonal grudges. The way that Cobb being jealous of Burrick's attention to Fitz led him towards essentially supporting Regal's coup. I thought it reminded me so much of like the whole J.K. Rowling scenario where she, you know, like got her feelings hurt on Twitter and then all of a sudden is like a full-blown TERF. And it's like these kinds of things that start out as like one person has this petty interpersonal conflict, and then all of a sudden people have built this entire worldview, or they've like gone totally to the dark side based on like commitments and perspectives and views that they probably would never have gotten to if not for the like, you know, this like interpersonal catalyst that was something so small. And so anyway, so I just thought that arc of Cobb's was really true to life and so well done. And, you know, this is for a character who's only on like maybe 20 pages. I just thought that was so wonderful. You know, the sort of microscopic level at which we see this story play out, and how much the like macro level of everything really just isn't the point at all. I also thought it was really interesting that this book is not very fun for a book that is about the journey, not the destination. So many fantasy books that are books that are not really about where you're going. I'm thinking Name of the Wind primarily here. You know, that is a book that is about the journey, not the destination, but the journey is super fun. Like, nothing very bad ever happens, and most of the scenes are the main character being really good at stuff, being a better musician than everyone, and a better magician than everyone, and outsmarting everyone, and that's just fun to get to read, right? But this is not like that. This is, you know, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages of kind of a painful slog, and it is amazing to me that Hobb has managed to make it something that I actually wanted to read. So yeah, that's my, I guess, final takeaway is I think the way that she has observed the characters is so engrossing and compelling that it's like, even though this is a long, slow, painful experience, I absolutely loved reading these books, and they have really stuck with me after reading them. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you'd like to hear more from me, please consider subscribing. And thank you so much for spending some of your one wild and precious life with me watching this video.